All right, so we're recording. Hi,
Hi.
Meili. Right.
Hello.
I'm trying to think about who would be watching this. I don't really have a big YouTube audience yet, so it's kind of just I guess mostly my Twitter friends, I guess. And my goal with my channel has been to kind of just have very casual conversations with, well, so most of my videos are about myself, so it's just me rambling about stuff. And when I have friends over, I try to have very informal, casual chats about whatever, as long as it's interesting to both of us. And
Mhm.
I guess let's talk about like how did you find me again? Do you remember? Or what prompted you to reach out? What
I'm
is
not
your
sure how I found you. I think I felt like we were like-minded people on the internet just
mm-hmm,
from the
mm-hmm.
types of things that you posted.
Right.
And there was some point in time where you said, I quit my full-time job. Everybody said
Right.
I was going to be poor,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. I remember
and
that.
that has not. And I've
Mm-hmm.
like just self-published a book.
Right.
And that's when I reached out to you because I was like, hey, everybody keeps saying the same thing to me. And I just
Right.
left full-time work in July, and my side
Mm-hmm.
projects have essentially taken over my life. And I've always wanted to
Right.
write.
Nice.
So I was like, let's talk. I want to know how you're making it work. Like,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, how are you making it work as far as like life in general is concerned, and
Right.
also for me personally, like getting over some of the shyness. I've been
Mm.
writing since June last year. I've been writing a newsletter,
Right.
but I've just been telling people that I speak to in person. So
Right.
it's like people I haven't to in person yet.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I haven't, they don't know about it. They don't know it exists. And so I've been trying to work up the nerve to not only be more public about that newsletter, but also just write more. Especially because I just had the recent experience of writing a little essay in January,
Uh-huh.
when Kobe Bryant died, and
Right.
people's response to it was so heartwarming.
Right.
I think I'd
Yeah.
always like harbored this idea that like writing or just like your own personal creativity was somehow a selfish act.
Hmm.
Somehow, like subconsciously, it might have been like the
Right.
Asian parental upbringing or something.
Yeah,
It was
maybe,
like, go be
maybe. Right.
useful.
Yeah.
But what I realized was that like people really connected to things when I
Mm-hmm.
was vulnerable
Right.
and really open about things. And I found that really inspiring. Anyway,
Yeah.
so that's part of why I was like, you left a corporate job, you're making it
Right.
work, you
Yeah.
self-published a book. How are you
Mm-hmm.
doing all of that?
Right.
That's what, yeah,
Yeah, that's
that's it.
cool. Yeah, you're making me think now. I think for me, my backstory, I'm kind of so for a person, I'm kind of lucky given the context of the kind of thing that we're trying to do, in the sense that I've always had something. Like even when I was a kid, I was like trying to post stuff online publicly. So when you're very young, it doesn't feel real yet. It like doesn't matter what you're doing, because like you're a kid, you're in school, you don't really know. Like I guess you take crazier risks because you can't even think of like what negative things might happen. Maybe it didn't feel like a big deal when I started. And then since I was already doing it and I had already kind of gotten positive response. I mean, I got negative responses as well, which was always. But I always felt that whenever I got a negative response, almost always it seemed like it was a misunderstanding. I don't know if that's me kind of like being kind of wishful thinking, and kind of like I guess I'm invested in wanting to make it work. So if I get like a negative feedback, I maybe kind of want to look at it in a way that suits me. So I would think to myself that these people are just misunderstanding. But I mean, I would get a range of feedback. So some of this early stuff I was writing was like just very very superficial, like local social commentary, which is like, hey guys, like the responses to X news event have been so kind of angry or petty or whatever, like can't we be nicer? And then I would get some people saying yes, we should be nicer, and then they write me like a long paragraph about how they feel that way too. And then some people will be like, oh, like you're just some naive idealistic fool, right? And then sure, like like, and the thing is, when I was writing that at that time, I wasn't even sure of what I really felt. I mean, I said what I thought, but it's not like I had a ton of, it wasn't my final word on it. And there's this quote that I really like from, I can't remember who. It might be Anais Nin, but I think she might have been quoting somebody else when she was saying that, like, nothing is my final word on anything. Like, whatever it is you say, like, you may then get feedback that then has you revising what you think. And that itself is another thing that I feel like some people feel that if you write in public and you publish, it's like you must be thinking so highly of yourself that you're so important that your voice should be heard and people should hear what you have to say. But I actually honestly think that I approach it from like, my thoughts are not perfect and I don't know what I don't know. And the only way I'm going to figure out like a better perspective is if I share stuff and then people tell me what I'm missing. So it's like I'm publishing to find out what I'm missing, what my blind spots are. Like you can't really figure out your blind spots by yourself. You kind of have to let people tell you what they are. And like, I guess there's a bit of luck of the draw where whether people are going to tell you in a compassionate way or like in a harsh and cruel way. But
right, there's a combination of luck of the draw and
right,
the style and tone that you're choosing
right,
to write with, whether or
that's
not you're
true.
writing in a way that's like humble and open
Yeah.
and people feel like they can tell you stuff. But I
Oh
like
yeah.
what you're saying because it implies that you're thinking aloud and you're trying to like engage people to think with you. Like you're
Yes.
not trying to think at them.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe just because of my life experiences, I've had so many times where I feel like I'll say some little thing and a million people want to jump on it and pick it apart. And
Right.
that's made me like a little bit shy,
Right.
to feel like, oh, I need to have everything backed up, do all my research, like check
Right.
out what everybody's saying
Right.
and like have the citations. That
Right.
may also be the fact that like I have like a research / scientific background, right?
Yeah.
But this is I'm talking about like a different kind of writing, like the kind of writing
Right.
that you do or that I'm interested in doing is it's not about being bulletproof or like
Right.
having tight
Yeah. There's definitely also
mentalness with yourself,
mm-hmm.
saying like, here's some rough thoughts.
Right.
Just here's some thoughts I want to share with you so we can kind of start this asynchronous dialogue of thinking together about something.
And yeah, I guess it's true what you say about like the vibe that you put out, because like, so I have friends or peers who I think have similar interests, but they run into more like, so everybody's experience ends up being quite different. And I think there's a gendered component to it as well. So like I try to persuade my wife to, so my wife has also written in the past and she's had more bad experiences than me. And like, when we look at it, it's like we both very similar people with similar perspectives on things. And like consistently the responses she gets, like, I mean, so again, like we each get a spectrum of responses, but when you look at the two experiences over time, it's like there's a disparity there, which is, it's so unfair. And I'm always trying to help people see how that is unfair, because again, it's like if you then discourage certain groups of people from participating in this process, then the collection of public utterances we have is like limited to some people's perspectives. And then if that becomes the dominant perspective and you don't get to hear other people's point of view, then it's like this negative spiral of, if you don't hear people like you and you don't see people like you wonder if what you're thinking is actually kind of wrong or alien, or you doubt yourself, and then it gets crazy. So it really is such an act of service, even to, and so again, like again, when I say that, it's like I find myself thinking, okay, like yes, like it is true that in fact, I would say all creative acts are acts of service in a sense, just by showing people that, you can do this kind of thing, you can think out loud. But at the same time, it's like I can imagine some version of myself or some other person out there who would interpret that in a way that's not helpful to them. Like they'll be like, oh, it's like I just wanted to journal on the weekends, and now it's like this is how I serve my community. Like that's like a burden to bear in a way, right? Like I have to even with your tentative thoughts, or like what was meant to be casual or natural, if it starts to take on this, like it can be possible for some people to fall into like a kind of, I'm thinking messiah trap. But I mean, I think different people have different interpretations of how it is difficult for them. So for some people, the idea that something that they thought was, oh, nobody's going to care about it, and then you frame it as, oh, but if you do it, then it simply you doing what you're doing will be of use to other people. That idea can be nourishing for some people, but it can also be like a little bit overwhelming for some people. So you have to kind of pick the right thing for yourself, and you have to know yourself well enough for like what works for you, which is an
Yeah, it's interesting.
interesting, yeah.
It's an interesting, yeah, there's a bunch of balances to try and strike, I think, in creative work. I've been reading Creative Quest by Questlove. And it's nice. It just feels like his manner of writing and tone is very casual. It feels like he's just like hanging out and talking to you about all these incredible stories of musicians. I highly recommend it. But he talks about like also striking that balance between doing something that's deeply for yourself, but also recognizing that there's an audience out there. Right. And in a way, you do have to design your stuff so that it can be received, which is another difficult balance to strike. It's not the same one that we were talking about, but it's like a related one in the creative field. And it's interesting to hear from the perspective of such a like prolific storied musician that he's had struggles with that. And all the examples of like other people and the way that they've dealt with it. So there's this one story that he tells, which I love because I'm also a DJ and he's a DJ. So he talks about making this incredible set where basically he's created the history of American music in a DJ set, and it all like flows together. And he got invited to some fancy wedding whose name he can't name, who got married. And he's DJing the set. At some point in time, somebody comes up to him and says like, hey, can you play something so that those kids will like dance more? So he has to pivot off of what he had in mind and cater more to the crowd. And he said that like the crowd increases by 200 or 300%. Everybody loves what he's doing. And as a DJ, you're not just playing songs, right? It's a journey that you're choreographing for this group of people. So he goes completely off of what it was that he had in his like artistic minded vision for his people.
Nice.
And at the end of the day, like everybody was like, that was like your most amazing set ever. And he feels like shit because it wasn't what he wanted to do. And after reading that story, I was like, oh, wow. I mean, if this happens to him and you apply that to like so many other creative exploits, like, man, this is something that like, I guess every creator wrestles with.
Yeah. The amazing thing to me is how much any one of these things very naturally and easily becomes a metaphor for like everything else. Which doesn't which I don't think is as true for everything. Like I think with creative output, I remember Elizabeth Gilbert in one of her TED Talks, she was talking about like just this persistent kind of trope that artistic and creative people have to be like mentally so they use there's this association that people who make great creative work, like great literature and great music, they seem to often also be people who struggle with mental health issues, for example. And then it's kind of like then people kind of confound the thing, and they'll be like, oh, maybe you can only make great art if you're miserable, or if you're kind of like a little bit mad in some way. And then first she says like, are you okay with that? Because I don't think, did I lose you? Oops. Did I just lose you? I think you just came back. Okay, that was weird, but I think it I think it should be still recording. Right. I was saying, so Elizabeth Gilbert was talking about how, so first she talked about how she thinks it's a bit silly that, that people almost have this slightly, it's in a way you can think of it as a prejudice. In a way you can think of it as like a stereotype, like kind of just a simplistic mindset that, like so some people will joke things like, oh, you can't write songs when you're in a happy relationship, like when you break up and then now you're gonna get the creative juices flowing. Like that's kind of like, and so she talks about how that's kind of silly. And then at the same time, when you talk to creatives in private, like that often seems to be true to some degree. So like there's this funny tension of and then she says something like, we don't do ourselves any favors. Like, you don't really hear about I think she said chemical engineers or people who are kind of working in more technical or less, I guess, fields where the work you're doing doesn't simultaneously become a representation of you and your identity and your like
Mm,
personality. So like, you hear of writer's block or like creative block, and you don't really hear so much about like technical. I mean, I'm sure if you ask like someone who codes, for example, they'd be saying like, oh, I didn't write any good code today. Like, like they just had an off day or something. But I think the
oh
slight
yeah,
distinction,
totally. I mean, sometimes it's
right?
like some bug that can't fix, or yeah, like you just
Mm-hmm.
get stuck and there's some bug you can't fix or it doesn't flow. Yeah, totally.
Right. And yeah, so
Yeah.
that part does seem, so I wonder like what the distribution of that is like across all the different fields and all the different kind of things you could possibly be doing. So yeah, and the thing is each person only has mainly their own perspective, right? So it's tempting to think that, oh, only my struggles are so, like um exalted, and everyone else their struggles are like, I mean, yeah, you struggle, sure, but is it like existential? And I'm like, yeah, I'm sure like, an engineer who's like hasn't been able to fix a bug for a couple of days, you start to doubt yourself and be like, can I do this? Do I have the skills and the abilities? Am I a fraud? Like, I'm pretty sure that's also a thing. But at the same, I feel like having done a few different things, so having worked on, so my background in my career was like marketing and writing content for to sell software basically. But like I do feel like when I couldn't get that stuff right, it's still a little bit different from when I'm trying to express something in like my personal writing and that's not coming out. Like there's some similarities, but there's also, I guess what I'm trying to make sense of is kind of like how much of the work that you're doing are you associating with your personal identity, and like there's a healthy amount of separation to be had, so that if the work does um badly, you don't kind of take it as a personal failure, and if the work does
Yeah.
well, sometimes it does better than you expect, and you shouldn't let that get to your head, right?
Yeah, I also think it has a lot to do with like what the content of your work is. And I think
mm,
if you're doing writing and the writing is deeply personal, then like a large chunk of the invisible work is internal to you.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
you have to go inside you and figure out like what you think or how you feel, or in the case that you might be writing something that involves a story, like
mm-hmm,
piecing apart what happened. How are you going
right,
to tell that story in a way where like somebody else like feels it in their body when you're walking them through a space or something like
yeah,
that?
yeah,
And so that work is like, yeah, there's all this largely invisible internal work that you have to
mm-hmm,
do that winds up connected to your product. Well, as if
right,
you're just handed a problem from somebody else, you don't have
right,
to do any of that. You just like, you can read the
mm-hmm,
requirements, so you kind of look at the problem.
right,
Um, and I think in like, for me, having an engineering background and having a design background,
mm-hmm,
like, I think that's kind of where the distinction comes, because a lot of designers, when they first start out, they put
mm-hmm,
so much of their own
yeah,
internal um, feelings or fingerprint or style or things like that into their work. And it can be very difficult when it's client
mm-hmm,
work, because
right,
it might not be suitable for the project, even if it's suitable for or like that. And that's something that's like a whole journey to go through. Engineer wise, like it manifests in a different way. Like some people have styles of the way that they like to do things, and sometimes those styles aren't compatible either with a professional setting, and that could be a real struggle. But
mm,
um, but the thing that you were talking about feeling like a fraud when you can't do something for a couple of days, like I think it's funny for me as somebody who studied engineering to an advanced degree, that every time I look at code I've written, I'm like, I wrote that. I wrote all that shit. Was that me? That must have
right,
been some other person. Like I have this like
right,
weird dissociation with everything that I accomplished, including something as like supposedly concrete as code.
right.
I don't know if it's going to be like that with the creative work, whether or not I read it. I think it'll be a success if I can read it and feel like, oh yeah, that was me. That sounds like me, you know?
That's an interesting thing. I think I think if you're planning to do these things over a long period of time, I find that helpful. I find that so rather than kind of associating myself for better or for worse with any single piece of work, I think that because I've kind of pre-committed to I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life, basically. And when I look back at some of the stuff that I've written, sometimes I've written so much stuff that I don't recognize a bunch of my own stuff, which is a very good thing. I highly recommend that every person. So like one of my riffs that I keep going back to with people is that you should be prolific in whatever it is you're doing, whether you're coding or you're writing, whatever. You should do so much of it that you don't recognize some of it just out of sheer volume, because then you can see that you'll see that some of it is better than you thought was possible, and some of it was worse than you thought. And you don't feel bad about it because you don't really recognize it. So it's not even, it's like it has your name on it, but like you're like, oh, I wrote that. Like, okay. And then it's like, I find it gives you this sense of like, it's almost kind of zen. It's kind of like, oh, it's sometimes you'll get it. Like there's a general progress over time, but sometimes you have like amazing hits and you don't know where they came from. Sometimes you have really bad days and you don't really know where they came from. But like you're like, it's you.
Is there a pattern for you there? Because I know that like for when I was more prolific doing tons of design work all of the time, right. I feel it was like a 6-month expiry where I would look back and be like, bleh, for like a lot of stuff. Not all of it. There's some stuff from like 20 years ago that I'm like, wow, actually that held up. But for the most part, there's a lot of, there's a pattern there.
I think in prolific phases, I think 6 months is a pretty accurate like rule of thumb where every 6 months you're basically a different person, like in terms of right. And yet, like there are times. So when I look back on my old writing, sometimes it's an interesting challenge for editing my old writing sometimes, or trying to update it, because sometimes I look at it and it's like it's clunkier. For example, like usually most of the time when I look back on my old writing, it's almost universally clunkier, and the further back I go, the clunkier and clunkier it gets. But sometimes there is something that is expressed in the clunkiness that I can't quite replicate. I can't just edit it down and have it be better in of itself. Like if I wanted to, like, I would have to rewrite the whole thing from scratch, basically, if I wanted to make it work now. And it's kind of humbling / sobering to see that. It's like I would, so I guess earlier in my process, I would be more bold with my assertions, I think. And there's like pros and cons to that. It's like sometimes I'm like, how can you say that? That's like unqualified, or like, it's unsubstantiated. But like there's a certain, I guess, conviction to it that if you start the hedging and be like, oh, in case of this, but in case of that, and then you're like, like by the time you get to your point, it's like it's kind of diluted. And so even that, I circle around it a lot. It's
that's fascinating. I feel like I have like the exact opposite journey where like I used to hedge so much. Every friend who ever helped me edit would say like, oh God, stop hedging, stop qualifying, just like say the thing. And we just wind up in this argument because I was like, but it's inaccurate. You're being inaccurate. I can't make a blanket statement about this because that's just not how anything works. Like nothing works like that. And they're like, well, so do you want to write like that like all of the time? It's really uncomfortable, and it's really it's muddy, and it doesn't feel clear or like straight or to the point. And so what I've started doing now is just like every time I see myself doing that, I'm like chopping it out. And I'm not like going back over in my head and saying like, oh God, but that's not actually accurate. Like, whatever. There's a Gaussian distribution, and at this end, this actual thing happens. But I'm talking about this section, like fuck that. Like,
and I think that is very much the struggle. And I find that like there is a quality to writing, and it's very hard to pin down. Like you can't explain it like in the abstract out of it, but like when you're reading anybody's work, actually you can tell. Like and I've noticed sometimes if I like start a writing session and then I get interrupted or something, and then I try to come back to it, it doesn't work anymore, like in the context of that writing session, because there was a flow going on and I interrupted it. And I think that can happen with editing as well, which is like, if you, and again, I think another Anais Nin quote that I really like was that she talked about how the only way she was able to get her writing to be good was to just write from scratch over and over again. Because when you try to do this kind of bits and pieces editing, like there's something about the pacing and the choices and stuff that you make that it just starts to choke the life out of the sentences. And then even if you've managed to include all the details, it's no longer fun to read, or it's no longer engaging in some way. And then it's like, then you kind of you might win the battles but lose the war, in the sense. It's like, yeah, you got all the details in, but nobody wants to read it. Or like, if people read it, you kind of lose them along the way. And then it's like, you kind of accept a trade-off where, okay, I can't convey like 100% of what really happened, but like I get the spirit of it with like 70% of the details in a certain way. And that's better than if I try to force in all the details and like it becomes unreadable. And like, yeah, it's just you keep, there's no like answer. Like, you have to keep doing it again and again, and you just develop new ways of squaring the circle, in a sense.
Have you read Bird by Bird?
Yes,
by Anne Lamott?
it's one of my favorite books. Yeah, it's really good.
Oh, it's great. Yeah, it's great. And I was like, the term, obviously, like shitty first drafts is like something that just like sticks with you after you've read that book, or even if you've read that book like a couple of times. Just the term shitty first draft is so helpful.
Yeah.
I feel like with everything, and whenever I think about writing process, I don't know, that book has just like influenced everything. You just like, just keep going, like bird by bird.
Right. So the
Word by
amazing
word.
thing,
You just have to build it one brick at a time.
Mm-hmm. So the amazing thing for me about writing an ebook that has really set me free was that I can publish a version 1 and then I can update it like a month later with a version 1.1, which is like, you can't really do that with a I mean, you can print and publish like a printed book and like a first edition, and then you have a second edition, but that's like, it feels way more like you can't ship a scrappy first edition paperback and then like tell people, hey guys, this is like, that's just not, people expect like the assumptions people have and the expectations of what you're paying for with a paper book is kind of daunting. So I think if I didn't have the option of shipping an ebook, I probably would have taken I'm almost afraid to think about it. It's almost, I think I might have taken like a couple of years longer, maybe even several years, I don't know. But like, because I can ship an ebook to, so I've sold like 300 copies so far. And I'm already looking at my ebook and being like, oh my God, I can't believe I released this. And there's so much stuff in it that should be reworked, that I couldn't tell what had to be reworked until after people had already seen it. And
so are you using the feedback that,
yeah.
Is this because you're receiving feedback from people, or is it like yourself like reading back through it, or is it both? How are
it's
you?
Both. It's both. I really feel,
okay.
So some people say things like, there are some typos you just can't catch until immediately after you hit send. I feel like that's really true. It's really true. It's like, in my experience, I don't know why. It's just, I don't know if it's psychological. I don't know if it's just once it's live, you look at it with a different perspective since it's real now. But
I also find that like time is also just a factor. Like because most of what I've been writing over the last year have just been these monthly newsletters, because I've been on this journey that now has stopped in its tracks, obviously due to what's going on in the world. But I've noticed that I can't, like, it's almost like the thing has to cook.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
it's just got baking time. Like, it can't just be written and sent.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've noticed that, like, for example, you have to sleep on it, look at it the next day. Sometimes it takes a couple of days. I wonder whether or not different writers have different lengths of time, but for me, there's definitely like minimum bake time. And if I skip it, then like the regrets, like the amount of regrets for shortening of that bake time, it's just higher.
So
it's like the yolks are still wet.
An amazing thing that just happened for me was, so I initially wanted to ship version 1.1 of my ebook like last month, but I've been procrastinating on it and I didn't know why. Like, I mean, I just didn't feel like working on it, or I felt like just this vague sense of not yet. I don't know why, but not yet. And then, like, while doing other things, I ended up researching a bunch of stuff like for fun about at some point I wanted to make a public database, like a Roam database that I can share with my friends for unrelated reasons. I just felt like doing it. And then when I was doing that, I started thinking, okay, what should I put together for this Rome database? And I was just thinking, okay, I wanted to read up about like scenes, like different scenes throughout history, like intellectual scenes and like golden ages of cities, and just how did they come together, how did they come about, like what, why was some city super great for some period of time and then not anymore. Like, I wanted to just put together some notes on that just for fun. And then like halfway through it, I started getting stuff that I realized that I should be putting into my book, that there's no way I could have known that like a month ago. But like now I'm like, okay, I'm gonna, like, I would not have thought about this until this happened. And then I find myself like wondering, like, is there some subconscious wisdom that's telling me to wait for that? Like that seems too perfect. Like it can't be there.
Although
But
I like what you're saying about like the fact that it's a different medium. The fact that ebook is a different medium from a paper
right.
book. The fact that you can like publish dot versions and update. I mean, I think that's super interesting. We talked a little bit, I think this was a conversation you and I had about like sort of the spectrum of publishing.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
everything
How
from
formal.
like there's like private, public, formal, informal, permanence,
Right.
the
Yeah.
ability to update, size of audience. Like Twitter is interesting because it's like this spontaneous, like kind of little thoughts that you just kind of, like let free to a large audience.
Right.
Newsletter is like very small and audience with very long thoughts.
Right.
And then there's like multiple axes of spectra. What is it that you can do that takes advantage of all of the different aspects of each medium, right? If you're going to publish an ebook, you can update it. If you're going to publish, a Twitter, it's like more of reach, more of a tease, synchronous conversation like we're doing right now. This is a different thing. Like, what is it that people get out of this that they're not going to get from reading either of our writing, right? This is like the dialogue style, our I don't even know. I haven't put names to all of that yet.
But yeah, I love that we are exploring that. I feel like a lot of people that I talk to or who come to me to talk about this sort of thing, like usually they tend to be pretty fixated on some form, like some style. So they might be, and even I guess when I was starting out, like some part of me was like, oh, I want to write a book, like a book, like just because you go to the library and you borrow books, you go to the bookstore and there's like book, you just have an emotional connection with that and you want to participate in that.
We've talked about how much we both love books and like grew up with them.
So I that's definitely like at some point I have to have a book with my name on it. Like it's a thing that I have to do. But it's interesting to reflect on how if you get too attached to some particular form, like then you might be missing out on what may actually be right for you in the moment. And it's kind of like the DJ set thing, right? Like it could be that you've invested all this time and energy trying to do A, but actually you should be doing B given the particular circumstances that you're in. And there's not a lot. I mean, I'm sure we can find it if we go looking for it, but I feel like not many people think about it in that way. Like, so they might think that, I should, like somebody might be thinking I should write a in-depth blog post about something. Like I should, I think that's very common. I see it very often that people say something like, I have this very ambitious project that I want to work on, but it's so big that I have to do all this research. It's going to take me like 10 years to figure it out and get everything. And I'm like, why don't you just tweet about it? Like, why don't you just do a video about it? Like kind of just to see what happens. And I mean, so a part of it might be perfectionism, like kind of, and part of it might even be a slightly escapist perfectionism. It's like, if it's a very big project that's very polished in your mind, then you don't have to deal with failure or rejection, like in a smaller scale, more immediately. You can kind of be thinking, I'll get to it one day, kind of, or like you might be doing the work, but shipping something soon, like a fragment of it, or talking to a friend about it potentially, right? Just whatever smaller version of it lets you develop like the feedback that you get from that will inform the next steps. Yeah, exactly.
You learn faster. I mean, I think that's part of why, like, if you look back at work that you did recently and you're like, oh God, I just saying all these bad things about it. You could kind of look at it two ways. And one way you could look at it and say like, wow, it was so shitty like 3 months ago at this thing. Or you could be like, wow, like 3 months later, I'm looking back at this with such a different perspective that I must have learned or changed so much as a person. And that's like
Yeah.
a really good thing.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the same thing goes for like when we were talking, I think we talked about this a little bit last time. We talked for the first time about the transfer of media, which is interesting because Questlove talks about as well in his book. Like as a creative person, how using different media, like he talks about how a lot of prolific jazz musicians were painters, and how just like how a lot of musicians in general work with different media. But I think the same thing goes like in different media, whether or not it's like writing or video or music or painting. Like, doesn't have to be traditional media either. It can be new media, because
Right.
all of the different things provide you with different constraints and advantages, and that brings out a different aspect of your creativity.
Yeah.
And then when you add the dimension of like casual formal to it, like you said, you gather a lot of data, which is very much how like comedians work, and you know, everybody that's like studied the creative processes of everybody that does lots of iteration, they figure out a way to do lots of rough things and gather information, like comedians going to like the tiny little casual spots first and testing out their routines, and then those things rolling up into the bigger ones. So it's like figuring out how to do that with your writing is a thing. I think one thing I struggle with a little bit that's interesting is that I don't know what do people, because I've done so many different types of things, I sometimes wonder like, what do people want? It's not like I'm trying to do it because people want it, but I know that, for example, if I tweet about my friends in Southwestern Colombia who are from like an endangered indigenous group that's a language isolate who need help right now because of COVID and them not being able to have food, like almost nobody feels like they're paying attention, because I think I'm primarily followed by designers. Well, I don't know. I'm not going to sort of look into that further. But when I tweet about the difference between like a continuous curve rounded corner, like two different styles of corner radii mismatching, all of a sudden it like completely blows up because we're all designers and we're all bothered by this thing. So I'm like, okay, so yeah, I'm curious to know whether or not for you, when you started writing about different things that from what your current audience or your current set of contacts might have been interested in, like what happened, did like a bunch of people leave, or did a whole bunch of people join, or did you just ignore all of that and you're like, this is me and I'm just going to keep doing my thing?
I've swung on this pendulum a little bit. So
okay, this is good to know.
Yeah. So when I started out, I was writing whatever I liked, I think. Like, no, when, early on, right at the beginning, I was writing for my friends, like literally as a kid, writing like what happened at school, what I did after school, who I met, you know, that kind of very like Facebook statuses kind of blog posts. And then when I started doing that social commentary stuff on my blog, kind of half by accident, half kind of like, oh, it's an emotional outburst kind of thing. And then I got a lot of new responses from like strangers and like new people that I hadn't met. Then I felt like, oh, like I've tapped into something that you know, like 10 times more people are interested in. Like, this seems like something I should be doing. Like you know, there's something here. It's like, I guess it's kind of like getting a sort of product market fit in a way, and it feels important, which is a slightly dangerous, which is a bit of a dangerous feeling, right? Because then I leaned into that, and I like to think that I tried to stay true to my values as much as I could. So even when I spent like several years writing about local news and politics back in like 2011 and 12. And, you know, people would say that, oh, Visa is one of the more kind of rational and measured voices in the Singaporean blogosphere, where people were like flinging shit at each other. But even then, so even then I found myself getting carried away. I found myself kind of, I would prioritize things that I knew would get a reaction from people. And, you know, so I had boundaries that I wouldn't cross. So I wouldn't make stuff up. I wouldn't, you know, be like caustic or vindictive. But I knew that, you know, there are certain things that if I present it a certain way and be like, hey, look at this is a mistake that people made or whatever, like that would get way more attention than if I said something kind of like constructive but not spicy. And so like I would tell myself I would try to do everything, but over time I would be prioritizing the spicy stuff because that's what was getting reactions. And then that would invite, and even that, I think by itself is not necessarily bad. Like the content was okay, but that would invite more and more of the kind of audience that I didn't want. Like it would invite people who wanted to, who liked, who would read. So my title wouldn't be like clickbait, but like it would be enough that people would know that, oh, it's about the government or it's about the media, and like there can be a fight here, and then they would fight in the comments, and they wouldn't even really be reading the post properly. And there would be more and more of those people, and I started to feel really like what am I doing? Like, you know, like
Oh, yeah.
I'm not really making a difference that I wanted to. I mean, okay, in the earlier days, not as many people were doing it, and like Facebook and stuff didn't have a share button and stuff. So like it felt like even like giving the first cut commentary on a piece of news in 2010 felt like a public service kind of. But now it's like any piece of news comes out, like everybody has an opinion, and like the better stuff does get surfaced. So I don't feel so compelled to kind of have a first layer opinion on things. But even if that wasn't the case, I did feel like I was getting to a point where I felt like I had lost a sense of what my core priorities were, and I felt like I wasn't being directed by those priorities or values. It was more of like, oh, what's in the news today? Like, okay, you know. And so and then in like 2013, I had started my first job, and like I wanted to do well at work, and I couldn't do well at work and keep up with like the media chaos that I was participating in. I mean, I guess I would have tried to make it work if it felt like it was meaningful work, but it didn't really feel like it was meaningful work. So like I was like, okay, I'm just gonna walk away from the whole thing. And on retrospect, that was one of the best things I did for myself, because, and I remember like after I chose to work, I think I shut down. I'm not sure if I shut down my blog entirely or I just kind of, yeah, I think I deleted a whole bunch of posts, and I was just kind of, I don't think I did a dramatic announcement, but like internally I was like, I told myself that I wasn't going to do that anymore. And like for a few months after that, I actually felt kind of depressed. I felt kind of like just empty, I guess, because I was used to all the activity and response and shares and then like traffic numbers going up. Like that felt like, while it wasn't fundamentally meaningful, it felt, the activity felt like it was doing something for me, I guess. And then when the activity, when I shut that activity off, like there was just this blank darkness, I guess. Like there's nothing is happening, and I'm like I'm struggling at work, and then I go home and I'm like, oh, should I look up the news? No, I'm not gonna do that. And then I'm just kind of like nothing's happening. So what I did then was I decided to start my my personal writing project. So it's not private. It's 1,000 word vomits. It's on my main site, but I didn't market it. I didn't like share it with people explicitly. I just kind of wrote on that blog for myself and just kept publishing without telling people about it. And that was like, so the goal for that was to write 1,000 posts. I'm currently at like 786, I think. Like it has its ups and downs. Sometimes I write every day, sometimes I don't write for months. But I did that, and in doing that, like kind of writing for myself without an audience, I feel like I clarified what my own voice was and what my own priorities and interests were. And I think if I hadn't done that, I don't think I would be as good at Twitter as I am now, because it's like I have, like, people tell me like, oh, you know, when you tweet, it's like it seems like you have this clear voice and you know what you want to say, and like it's easy to read, and just all those things kind of come from the wood shedding that I did for myself in private. And yeah, so I guess having spent several years writing for myself in private, I started to get a sense of, okay, like here are the things that, you know, nobody has like 700 different things to say. Like, you know, like if you're going to write something 700 times, like you start repeating yourself, you start like saying the same things periodically. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because you start to find out what are the things you really care about and what are the things that like just, they don't go away by itself. And if there's no kind of news cycle for you to be like trailing behind, then it's just your own thoughts and your own concerns. And yeah, so now, so even with my first ebook, it's really, the way I think about it is like I have all of these kind of like I think of my mind, I guess, as like all like, and it's not just my mind, but like there's a landscape of things that I care about, and there's other people in the landscape, and there's other books and other stuff, and then there's like the riffs that I repeat over and over again. Meaning like I find that whenever a news event happens, or whenever not necessarily news, but like when things happen, I seem to return to certain points or written the certain talking points or certain
Mhm.
kind of insights or just things that I find myself thinking, oh, I made that mistake before and I made it again and I'm probably going to make it again, like, that kind of thing. And then I kind of collect those talking points. And so I would say my first ebook and my next couple of ebooks as well, they're all kind of like, if you map out the landscape, these are like the idea of like paving the cow paths, right? Like the things that you naturally kind of doing over and over again, and you just kind of formalize that a little bit. So it's funny now when anything happens, I can almost always very easily and naturally point to you how it relates to my book. And it's not because I want to market and sell my book, but it's because I wrote the book in that space. Like, I built the house on the point where everything intersects. It's like,
I almost think of it like this, like by doing this exercise, which I have more questions about, by the way, this like
yes.
1,000
awesome
piece exercise. It almost feels to me like what you were doing was like, you're in the dark room. It's like all you have is like this little point of light.
Yes.
And so you shot it in a spot, found that little point of light, and then did that a whole bunch of times until you could start to like form a little pointillist picture of where it was that you were.
Yes.
And that's what it sounds like you were doing, which I find fascinating. I mean, it's like that's also like it's a creative technique that gets used in other, like we use it in design as well, and we used it in R&D when I was working in research and development. It was a lot of like, okay, let me try a bunch of little prototypes, and then eventually this like big picture of where things are going like starts to emerge. My question is like, when you're writing for yourself out loud, did you find out that people were actually following along and reacting to stuff, and did that affect you somehow, or did it stay really quiet and you were okay and like super zen with that? Like, how did that sort of weird private public
it was very
you?
quiet. It was very quiet for several years actually. So now I have an attached Twitter account where every time I publish a post, there's a new tweet that goes out with the URL. And like now there's like, I think there's like 500 plus people following it, which is pretty crazy to me, because these are not things where like I'm writing with, hey guys, this is what I thought, this is what I'm really just, I start in the middle of a thought. Like I don't contextualize it. I don't explain it. It's just like, this happens and that happens or like whatever. And the idea that 500 people are following that is kind of slightly surprising. I mean, I mentally prepared myself for almost every possible outcome, I think. So it doesn't bother me. I think the people who follow me are very okay, how I would frame it is this. It's like so with my social political kind of blogging days, I had gotten so good at making a statement or whatever in public that was designed to pull attention from other people. So even if someone is not really my kind of person, like I would frame it in a way that's like, oh, you have to listen to this, like you can't not, like, that kind of thing. And my personal writing project was kind of the opposite of that. Like I was deliberately trying to, it's basically telling people I'm going to go on this really long and boring journey, and like, like if there's going to be anything interesting, it's probably going to be like on page 80. So like, the people who show up at page 80, like they know what they're getting into. Like they like it's so inaccessible that, and actually somebody pointed out to me that a lot of like religious pilgrimage destinations, like, the church is at the top of like a very high hill, and like you have to climb for a long time, like it's in somewhere kind of inaccessible, and the inaccessibility is kind of the point. So like you're alone and you're climbing all the way there, and you have time to be alone with your thoughts, and like, why are you doing this and why are you going on that kind of pilgrimage? And I think there is similarly there is a point to making something deliberately a little bit inaccessible, so that even if there's an audience, like, that they came all the way to see you. Like, it's not that, they came expecting a good time, and if they're not getting a good time, it's your fault, and like you were supposed to entertain them. I'm like,
Okay, yeah. Here's a funny comparison to that. It's a little bit like playing on a Friday or Saturday. You're in a band, so you get this because we both work in entertainment. It's like playing Friday, Saturday night at like a run of the mill popular heterosexual venue versus
Mm-hmm.
playing a Sunday or Monday night at some hole in the wall.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Like
And
Friday,
yeah.
Saturday, it's like no investment. People just show up and it like default. It's like
Mm-hmm.
default.
Yeah.
I think it's actually kind of similar to how people get attached to like, well, the design of difficulty of video games,
Mm.
one, and also pro software, where
Mm-hmm.
people become extremely invested in this thing because it was hard.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So
Yeah.
you have to,
Like sometimes people don't like it when you make a pro tool easier because they're like, but we're the experts. Don't make
right,
it easier for
right.
people.
Yeah. 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 So
Yeah.
it's important that you as an individual be honest with yourself about what you want and what your priorities are and why you're doing what you're doing. And at some point I kind of was hoping that I would eventually like like um somehow harvest the writing project. It's like, so it's gonna be a million words, and I'm like, I don't want it to kind of die. Like, I don't want it to be, I did the thing and then I forgot about it. I kind of want to like pull out what's good from it. But then I find that
Yeah.
when I started to have that mindset, I started procrastinating on the writing, because I'm like, oh, if I write something, it should be good enough that in the future I'll have some reason to use it. So it's really
Mm,
it can be tricky business. I think you have to have a sense of humor about it. It's like there's no, like, if you are like really, I find that doing large creative projects or like a series of projects for yourself is actually, it's very funny. It can be a spiritual comedy tragedy kind of experience, because like
if you let
there's
it be, right? If you let it be.
yeah. No, I think it's almost inevitable in some way. It's just, okay, how grand the experience is up to you, but like it's semi inevitable that even if, let's say, you decide you're going to do some woodworking, right, like for yourself, and there's no boss, you're not selling it, like, I mean, you get to decide, like, do you want to turn the hobby into something that you interface with other people about, like, it because it's so self-directed, you end up, it, like, every decision you want to make, you're like, oh, what should I do? And then you realize you can do anything you want, and then it becomes this this self authoring, like you get to decide every single thing, and then like each decision is up to you, and um like there's it's recursive, and it's yeah, you learn about yourself as you go. I find that sometimes, so I again, I swing back and forth on this. Sometimes I feel like you get to choose who you want to be, but sometimes I think it's also like that only seems like the case when you're operating within your comfort zone. And like if you push yourself in some way, eventually you almost kind of have like no choice but to be who you are. Like just like so like, let's say with regards to the formality thing, like I think everybody
Mm-hmm.
can, like, you can dress up for a black tie event, or you can go and like do some informal hang. Like everybody can do everything to some degree, but like I also think people tend to have some point in the sphere that's like their home. And again, like, you shouldn't, like you see how it's so recursive, right? It's about music, it's about, like, you shouldn't stay home all day, because that's not fun. But you shouldn't force yourself to spend all your time away from what feels good for you, because then, like, if you're not having fun, what's the point? So it's like this, it's play, and like there are no rules. There's, like,
Yeah.
it's infinitely amusing and entertaining and full of contradictions.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I think that one of the things that's been a pattern throughout all of this is that there's like a lot of self-observation.
Yeah,
There's a
yeah,
lot of
yes.
like, I noticed that when I was doing whatever it
Hmm.
was, that
Right.
this started happening. Like
Yeah.
that's been something that comes up multiple times. And I think that,
Yeah.
I mean, that's sounds like it's part of it's like built into the process. You've got to like notice how you're doing things, like notice yourself. I mean, like one thing I've been noticing lately is that what I want to do most of all right now is like write.
Mm.
And for some reason, and I think it might be sort of a sign of the times too, like I spend a lot of time just like helping other people with things
All right.
that I know how to do already that are not
Nice.
writing, or
Yeah.
sometimes they are writing.
Right.
But I'm not tending to make space for myself to do, you know, you're talking about like sitting down and not getting interrupted. Like I haven't been making time for myself to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a part of that self-observation that's like, why am I not giving myself this time?
Right.
And when you're talking about like you have no choice but to wind up being yourself, I think there's a framework that I've used in the past that kind of talks about the three parts of yourself. There's your default MO of like whatever you're comfortable doing, and it's just the thing that you do, which is clearly what I've been doing.
Right.
There's like how you get energy, which sometimes isn't that thing. Like sometimes you get a lot of energy from doing something that's different from what you're used to behaving like by default.
For sure.
And then there's like what you expect of yourself and other people, and sometimes that's like different from those other two things. It's just constantly like navigating those three spaces and trying to be like, am I doing this because I get energy from it, or is this just like me drifting through life like without being deliberate? And then on top of it, I think I was talking to you about this the other day. When you look at the list of human biases on top of it, it's kind of a wonder that we get anything done at all, because you're trying to be meta and like observe yourself, and then you also have like recency bias and
confirmation. It's infinitely tricky. And if you like when you think you figured it out, you probably just trapped yourself into a overly fixed perspective.
Right. And then 10 years later, you have like another layer of realization on top of the thing that you thought 10 years earlier.
Right. Yeah.
But so I think that's part of the fun.
Yeah. It's humbling, I find. Like, I like it will kick your ass, and that's good. Like, it would actually be kind of exhausting, I think, to embark on a creative journey and you think you have everything figured out. Like, you know what you're gonna do and you know what it's about, and like then it's like work. It's just like putting stuff together. Like it's moving boxes in a way, right? It's like
procedural.
Yeah,
right.
But like it's when that it's like when you're going through the procedure a little bit, and then like after you move a certain number of boxes, you see something new that you couldn't see before. They're like, oh wow, there's a whole new thing that you could be doing that unlocks like new energy and changes your expectations, and it's the fun. It's like, I think that honestly is the fact that life can do that to you, or like the creative process can do that to you. I think that's my jam. Like that's my juice. Like that, like it almost seems like a possible hack to the hedonic treadmill. Like, so anything else where like you just get more like when you try to get more pleasure out of a thing, but it has diminishing returns. And even with like let's say you're doing stand up or whatever, and like you do a special, then you do another special, and then like after a while it's like your 21st special is not going to satisfy you that much more than your 20th special, right? But like if along the way while doing it you witness something and you thought about something else and you think about doing a different project maybe, or you decide that your next project is going to be done in a different frame, whatever it is that kind of switches things up, and then it's fresh again, it's fun again. It's like when like learning, like sometimes I think so for me, I have writing, I also have music, and I like sometimes I dip into wanting to learn how to draw, which is like, and it's like, right. And when I do each, right, and each time I pick up, I kind of revisit one of these things, like my, like, so with drawing, like you start to see lines everywhere or colors or shades everywhere that you don't normally look at every day. Or like with music, it's like, when I start hearing melodies in like songs or soundtracks or stuff that I listen to that I don't think about, and then everything's fresh, right? And it's that feeling of everything is fresh that keeps me,
that's your jam,
interested. It's like it's a reason to be kind of excited to wake up in the morning, I guess, as opposed to I have this to-do list and I have to fill out everything on my to-do list, and then it never ends. There's always going to be more.
Yeah, that's really profound right now, I think, because so many people are in their homes, like with this stuff going on outside, and just making their way through to-do lists. So it's a little bit of like, okay, well, how do we do something to keep things fresh, and how do I do that with an energy that doesn't feel judgmental? right? Because there's a
Yeah.
lot of stuff going on out there where people were like, if you haven't picked up a new skill, like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah.
It's it's
No,
it,
it's like not
it's
that makes it into a
right.
checkbox.
It's
They just
amazing.
took all
Yeah.
of the fun and made it into a
Right.
checkbox.
It's amazing how creative people are at sucking the soul out of like a new thing, right? Like it's like some people get mad at it, like, you know, like, oh, you're ruining fun? Why are you ruining fun? And like I feel like then that starts like people start arguing about it, and it gets it's like that's an old game, right? Like arguing. But if you can see how it's funny, like then I find like if you can make people laugh and you can laugh at yourself, like, so again, like you crack yourself up, right? So you had this frame, like, I'm gonna do this thing, and then you realize that it's silly, and then once you can laugh at it, it's like, okay, having laughed at it, do you still want to do it, or do you want to do it differently, or do you want to, and as long as you can find, so even if you are trapped in some terrible, I mean, okay, I don't want to preach at people because, you know, everybody's situation is different, but I have found
Yes.
that when I look back on, so in like 2015, I was like legitimately depressed, even though my life was going all right. Like, you know, I'm happily married to my wife, who I love. I had a job that I enjoyed, you know, that with great colleagues, and like everything was like, you know, on paper everything was good, but it just felt like life felt like a jail sentence to me at the time. Like I was waking up in the morning, taking the train to work, and like it's the same thing every day, and then I would go home and I would like watch TV or whatever for half an hour, and like it just felt like, and then I have like my mortgage to pay for the next 25 years, and it just like, is this my life? Is this it? Am I going to be doing this? Is this going to be a rerun every day until I'm like old and it's like, and and like it, you know, the way that I kind of broke out of that, it's not like anything changed. It's not like none of those things went away, but like I was listening to Alan Watts on YouTube. I can't remember how I rediscovered him, but like he's just so cheeky. Like everything he says, he sounds like he's telling a joke even when it's not funny. Like, and it just it's infectious. He's like, you know, he described things the way I just said, like how like we can be so creative at making ourselves miserable, and like that, and like again, like that might, it might not be the right thing for someone to hear, but if it hits you the right way, and again, if it doesn't hit you the right way, you should ignore it and you should move on to something else that is right for you. But if it hits you the right way, you just laugh, and then you're like, and then you realize that there is like this little space between like the difficult thing, and it's still difficult, but like if you can find that little space for yourself, and you make, there's like an inside joke for you and yourself or whoever else you're with, like then it's fun. And I think, yeah, again, like a lot of doing creative work for me is about trying to find some kind of humor, or trying to find some kind of inside joke or reference to something else. There's like, so some of it is just for me, some of it is for like people who've known me a long time, and yeah, as long as it's fun.
I think that the thing that I mentioned to you last time, because sort of two things. This talk that I give in February when I went to San Francisco.
Yes, I remember.
Yeah. So like what I say sort of at the beginning of the talk, and you know, there's a little bit of preamble from my life, so you can learn why I think this way.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, some people see their lives as that thing that was making you miserable, which is like that series of like, I got a job and I have a house and I got a wife and she tick boxes. Or some people are like trying to optimize some graph that goes up and to the right. And at some point in time, I decided like, I don't want anything to do with any of that. My life is like this canvas, this like weird art, and I'm just going to fill it with like weird shit. And that's going to be my own personal work of art. And that's my life. And it's going to be weird, and it's going to be mine. And it's going to be unique. I can't compare myself to anyone else.
Yeah.
It gives me the freedom to not feel like it's linear or optimizing or anything. And that was really liberating to me. Although lately I'm starting to update that metaphor and think, okay, actually, I think it might be more than one canvas. Maybe it's like a bunch of them.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I mentioned to you, when you mentioned the little inside joke last time, I think we talked a little bit about John Berger's ways of seeing. And I told you that in that talk, there's like a little shout out to his BBC special from the 1970s. So if you watch it, you might see exactly the moment where it's there.
And the amazing thing
and
is,
anybody who, like, I didn't say it out loud, so you're either gonna know it or you're not.
Right. And like it might be like 0.1% of people who get it, but when they get it, they're gonna come to you afterwards and be like, "Oh my god!" And then like now you're instantly you bypass like months of friendship, I guess. Like you just kind of go straight to getting
I
to
remember
someone.
there was somebody, this guy, he's a designer, and I adore him. He was, of course, like I adore everybody that was on my design team when I
Yes.
left Khan Academy. But Vivek Venkatraman, when he was showing his portfolio for his job interview,
Right.
there was this little black flag
Mm-hmm.
reference just in the way that he arranged things on the slide, and we had a
Right.
whole bunch of like ex-punk rockers on the team, so that was just
Oh,
like hoomp, bypass, like all of a
yeah.
sudden. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very,
It's,
very insider. It's funny.
yeah. It's amazing that we can do that. Like that's so, and that's one of those things that I, having experienced it so many times, like finding out that there are people who don't experience that is like, it makes me want to show as many people as I can that they can experience that, because it's so enriching. It's so like it activates you, right? Like when you both start out assuming like, oh, is this conversation gonna be like a interview kind of thing, like, you know, like we're gonna try and meet each other's parameters, or we have some expectations of what it's gonna be, and then like you just have this little thing that flickers somewhere, and then you're like, oh, okay, this is happening. Like that's
Yeah.
just amazing.
I think it's also a way of like reaching out to everybody who's ever had some like little niche thing
Mm-hmm.
that they've come across that's resonated with them, and giving
Yeah.
them like a big hug in whatever that medium is. And just
Mm.
being like, I see you, like,
Yeah.
you know, even if it's just like a few chords from this one track that was
Right.
like on this
Yeah.
one B-side from this, I don't know, from like Pharoah Sanders, or, you know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
something that people don't expect to come in as a reference. And you just
Mm-hmm.
think it's a way of making people feel seen in a
Yeah.
really lovely
Yeah.
way too, which I think is cool. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So,
once I realized that, I find myself thinking, oh, how, and like, so every choice you make in like, even like how you decorate your house, or how you know, write your about page or whatever, like just every decision that you make
oh God.
where there's like a default option, you can also find something that you can do that if instead of the default option you pick something that evokes something else, and it's like, then now suddenly every object in your house, or everything around you, becomes an opportunity for connection, which is, it's a fun way to look at life, right? Or to look at things, like just
Mm-hmm.
everything is like a potential portal into something else, or like a talisman in a way.
Yeah, which it is. It's interesting. I think it's I don't want to get this wrong, but I might get it wrong. So a friend of mine he's part Cherokee, and I think he was trying to learn the language. And
Mm-hmm.
apparently you can't name things without naming their relationship to other things.
Oh, nice.
I think that's like
Yeah.
a really powerful linguistic thing. Like it makes me think sometimes about, you know how like in Chinese you can't say a quantity without saying the measure word.
Yeah.
So it's like unit conscious language. It's like you
Right.
can't speak this language without being aware of units. And I think
Right.
it's really interesting that there's a language that you can't, things don't exist unless you name the relationship they have to other things.
Right.
So you need to draw that back to the fact that like everything that you surround yourself with is like an opportunity to connect to other people or to connect to something else. It's like
Yeah.
there's a beauty in that our
There
language
is.
doesn't currently contain.
Right. I remember. So
Yeah.
I remember on our last call, you noticed my snake ring, right? And then we talked about
Yeah.
snakes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That was
Yeah. Oh, and I wore my
and,
rings today because I was
oh,
like, we
awesome.
talked about
Yeah.
hardware.
Yes.
Um, and I was gonna, yeah, there was one time I was part of this thing called the Future Soul Collective at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San
Mm-hmm.
Francisco.
Right.
And they did this exercise at the end of the sessions. They had gotten together like a group of different community people just to have this conversation. And they're like, give us one word that's your impression of this experience. And people were saying things like, you know, togetherness, community, things like that. And I said earrings,
Mm.
because there were a whole bunch of like incredibly powerful women of color attending this event, and everybody just had fucking fly as earrings, right? Like people's
Right.
earrings were great, like very wonderfully curated and chosen. All of them were amazing. And I was coming from a day job where one time I had a one-on-one with some like VP because he wanted to meet with everybody in his organization. And he leaned forward and looked at me and said, "Those are the most gigantic earrings I've ever seen in my life," to me.
Right.
And I was like, "You don't get out much, do you?" So it's funny because these little things, like we were talking about connection, and also like if you notice the way that people, obviously we can't do this right now, but like pre-COVID times, when you notice people's nails at checkout cashiers,
right?
Like there's a lot of people that are working there that just have like the most amazing like hand action, and just that moment of being like, your nails right now are amazing. Like you just like light up your own day, you light up their day, they light up your day by like taking care of the way that their hands look. Like it's just this lovely little something that seems quite transactional, but it's really like a lovely moment of human connection. I was thinking about that too when we were talking about your rings and how your accessorising is something that you've thought about as a way of connecting with other people.
Yeah, it gives them permission to say something, right? And it's like I feel like I still haven't fully acted on what I have learned from that. Like, you know, so again, it's like what I have learned from my rings, it should be a fractal thing that applies to everything. Like it's not just, you know, and I'm working on it. It's kind of it feels like a lifelong thing, but like I realized that you can really do it with everything, and it makes me want to be more just more more everything, more expressive, more playful, more like it just, I guess, which brings me back to another one of my talking points, which is just that, you know, like imagination deficits like rule everything around me, which is like just if you think, right, if you think that
I like the way you put it. The way that I've always put it is like, what we have is a failure of the imagination. That's like what I find myself saying.
True.
Go ahead.
And it's just it's again, it's so recursive because sometimes when you tell people that, like they'll stare at you blankly because like you can't imagine how your lack of imagination is limiting you. But
you can't, because that's the whole point.
So it's tricky. So I mean, so it's like a koan, I guess. Like once you get it, I guess. But like to help someone get it, you can't just say that to them because that's not helpful. Like it's rather you have to like surprise them with something that they hadn't considered, and then you have to bring them somewhere they hadn't gone before. Something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the power of like futuring as a practice. If you can paint a picture of a totally different adjacent possibility for people, and it's such a powerful act just to be able to do that. And it's not easy. Because a lot of the times people are seeing only what they're expecting to be seeing, right?
Like,
I don't know if this has happened to you, because you're also like, because we're both like multicultural people, we're like stereotype breakers in many ways. And I know if you had the experience of like, so I'll really, people talk about blah blah bias in tech and whatever, but as a person who's worked in entertainment, there have been times when I've DJ'd a set for 3 hours at a club, and when it comes time to wrap our cables and clean up, people come and try and kick me out because they think I'm just hanging out near the DJ booth.
Oh Jesus.
So I had another one where language is interesting because I'm fluent in Spanish, where people see me totally different when I'm speaking in Spanish from when I'm speaking in English. Like the mental picture in their head of who I am is like a complete switch.
Have you read?
So if you think about like, if you think about the way that people's perception is so strongly influenced by what they expect to see, then you think about the labor of you as a person who can future or create images of adjacent or a different possibility in somebody's mind. It takes like some amount of skill to get people's minds there. You know, depending on what medium you use, like some people are using special effects in video, but if we're writing or we're talking, like what is it that we can do to conjure that stuff up in people's minds? Anyway, so you were asking about me reading something.
Have you read Trevor Noah's Born a Crime?
No, it's on my list though.
Oh, you have to read it. You have to bump it up your list.
Okay, all right. I'm
majorly
gonna
bump it
bump
up
it
the
up my
list
list right now. I'll bump it up my
because
list right now.
he basically has multiple experiences like that where again he's like his parents are black and white, so he's
Mm-hmm.
mixed race in apartheid South Africa. And so he,
Yes.
like, for him it was like a issue of like social life and death. Like it was like he was at some point actually in not in prison, but like when you get arrested and there's like that holding cell kind of area, and he was like
Yeah.
in that place, and then he was like and like everybody there was either white or black, and he had to kind of like decide who he was going to rely on. Like it seemed almost like something out of a TV show. Like it seemed unreal. Like, but you read it and you can tell that it's real. That he had to make those decisions. And he talks about how like he could, like, there's this one point where I think he was going to get mugged, and he could hear the guys who were going to mug. They were walking behind him, and they were going to
Mm-hmm.
mug him, and they were like, "Hey, let's mug that guy." And then he's like, "Okay, I'm not going to be able to run away." And like they didn't. They're speaking in their language. I think in I'm not sure which specific language, but they're speaking in a language that they didn't expect him to know. And then he's like, "Okay, I can't run away. So what do I do?" And then he decides to turn around and like have a big smile and say, "Hey guys, who are we robbing? Let's go do it together." And then they laughed because they did not expect him. And the funny thing is, the moment he said that, they instantly had to completely reevaluate because they thought he's some like foreign, like a different person, right? He's not one of us. He's some they have their own system of morality or whatever, where like you wouldn't rob one of yourselves, one of your own people, but you can rob that guy because he's the reason. His people are the reason why this place is so bad, whatever. And then when he speaks to you in
Mm-hmm.
your own language, it's like it breaks their thing, and they have to laugh,
Yeah.
and they have to like him. Like they can't like yeah, just there's many little stories like that where you realize that like people's prejudices and assumptions and all those things are so conditional, and they don't realize what
Yeah.
those conditions are. And if you break one of those conditions, it's really like a kind of magic. It's like, and it can be it can it's wild to make sense of, because and like I think you can almost divide the world into people who are aware of this and people who are not. And I mean, I'm not saying that the people who are aware
Mm-hmm.
of this are all good people. Like, no, there are people who use that awareness for exploitative things. But like,
Mm-hmm.
before you see that, like, you're kind of thinking at the object level of, oh, some people are like this, some people are like that, and but you don't realize yet that your concept of some people is itself constrained by your assumptions about what they are, which is might be like, oh, people who are of a certain race, they don't read, and then you find out that there are nerds from that group of people and they've read more than you, and they're like, oh shit, like how do I think about and
Mm-hmm.
then it's just it's getting people to see that is also an act of service, I think, because and it's not it's an act of service in that you help the social cause that you're trying to help, but that's not the reason. That doesn't have to be the reason you do it. It's also an act of service in the sense that when you expand a person's sense of possibility about something, like you potentially expand their sense of possibility about everything, right? It's like, if
Mm-hmm.
that guy that we were going to mug turns out he can speak our language, like what else is possible, right? Like everything is possible. You never know. And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so it's just, then once you know
It's
that, it's like,
true.
right? Then you
Yeah,
have
it
to
can change
be,
everything.
yeah. So in a way, people who are kind of like prejudiced in some way, it's often like they're punishing themselves at the same time. Like, like they've limited their world into thinking that, oh, only these sort of people possess talents or gifts, and then they confirm their biases. And it's so, I think we talked about this the last time as well. It's like, so often it's framed as you are a bad person and you should become a better person by being good to the people that you are being bad to, which is never a fun sales pitch to receive. Whereas it's more of like,
No.
hey, like it's more like let me show you a magic trick, right? Like, let me show you, I can show you the world, right? Like this Aladdin magic carpet, right? Like you see all these people that you thought were like boring and lame and whatever, like they're actually phenomenal and exciting, and you can see this exciting, enjoyable world if you just change your point of view a little bit. And then it's like an
Yeah.
invitation. It's an invitation to the grand party that where it's all happening.
Yeah, and it makes everything fascinating all of a sudden instead of
Right.
just being all dull and like shades of gray and
Yeah.
not reference to the book. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's true. It's such a powerful, it's a powerful thing. And I think people, like you said, they don't realize that conditioning is happening.
Mhm.
Uh, and then we collectively lock ourselves out of
Mhm.
seeing so many things that are cool and wonderful that are actually out there just in front of our eyes the entire time, but we're blind to them because of,
Right.
you know, whatever pre-existing notions we have about stuff.
Mhm. Mhm. I think
Yeah.
a phrase that I have that's adjacent to the imagination deficit thing is kind of like a, you know, and so I remember I have a thread about this, which is about, like, you know, there's this phrase that's like, oh, you must empty your cup, you know, like you must and when people used to say that kind of thing, I wouldn't get it. I'd be like, well, what does that mean? Like what does it mean to
That's
empty your cup?
that's me right now. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's like let go of your assumptions or whatever, right?
Oh,
Like don't,
okay.
that's what it's supposed, like, I think the Zen story or whatever was like, some guy says he wants to learn something, and then his master is like pouring him tea, and then he keeps pouring it until he overflows, and then he's like, oh, why are you pouring so much tea? Like, and then the master's like, oh, well, you can't learn anything until, like, just as you can't drink the tea when it's overflowing, like, you can't learn anything until you first, like, empty your cup and unlearn what you have learned, you know, something like that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, but that never, you know, how I prefer to frame it for myself is kind of like, do you allow the world to surprise you? And I like that question more because it's like, I think people like, it feels like the obvious answer should be yes, like, obvious, like, why would I not allow the world to surprise me? But then you think about it and you realize, oh, actually a lot of us do have domains in which we remove the the prospect of surprise, because usually we think of surprises in a
Mm.
negative, like, you know, like, we don't want negative surprises, and so we take precautions, or we take, you know, we go into a meeting, or we go into just like, I'm gonna go on a date maybe, or go on just whatever the context is. You don't want bad things to happen, and so you go in with this very prepared mindset of, oh, this is gonna happen, then I'm gonna respond this way, and then this is gonna happen, and you have that frame. And in avoiding negative surprises, you also kind of shut out the possibility of positive surprises. And then so there's no surprises. Like, you understand everything that's gonna it's all connected. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier about like check boxes and stuff. It's like, if you want to have a plan where nothing can surprise you, you will probably get what you want for a large chunk of it, and then eventually, and then and even then, like, you can never iron out the sea, right? So, like, you can try and remove surprises, but eventually there'll be a global pandemic, right? Like, you can't stop that, so you're gonna get surprised in some way no matter what. So it's more of like,
I think
mhm,
I I think it's also that sometimes people attach their identity to being people who know.
yeah, yeah,
And if you attach your identity or your sense of security to knowing everything all of the time, then you also
right,
close yourself off to surprises, right?
yeah, yeah,
I've
and
seen
yeah,
I've seen a lot of that, especially in people whose like line of work is to know things.
yeah, so
And
you
you see
get
it
to
from
have a,
traditional pedagogy and schooling, right?
right,
It's like
right,
you
yeah,
know things and I don't, and I'm the empty vessel, and you're like putting things in my, which is like
yeah,
no longer the way
yeah,
that people think about teaching. It's like
thankfully,
counter modern
yeah.
teacher. Yeah, exactly. But
But
it's
yeah, you
like,
get to, if you I remember this with, again, so even with the political blogging and stuff, like, yeah, if you want to look good by winning, like, the way to win is by only playing games that you already know in advance that you're going to win, because, like, you know that, oh, I'm going to argue with this person because they obviously don't really know what they're talking about, so it's going to be easy for me to win.
mm-hmm,
But, like, then
okay.
you just repeatedly have that interaction over and over again, and you start to even feel shitty about people in general, and about, like, the way you interface with people and stuff. And, like, the other way is that you want to be surprised, and to be surprised you have to have conversations with people who, without knowing in advance what you're going to argue with them about, potentially, maybe. You know what I mean? Yeah, you're right. It's you have to be willing to not win every interaction in a way, right? Like not come
Yeah.
out of every exchange looking super professional and polished and perfect.
Yeah. I think the way that I like to think about it, like it just define winning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that something I'm really driven by is learning. Like I love
Yeah,
learning.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so for me, winning is like being surprised is winning because
Mm-hmm.
your world just opened up. You're like,
Yeah,
wow, I didn't go into that expecting that at all. What did I
yeah,
learn from this? And if you
yeah,
only get what you expect, like you said, that's nothing
right.
new. You're not like learning anything new. And that the reframing of things as learning means that you every time you learn something, you feel like you're winning.
Yeah,
It's great.
that is the it is the once you live like that for a while, it's very hard to go back. I think it's like just
Hmm.
why would you not? It's just so fun. It's so
Yeah.
playful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been amazing. I think we've talked for like over an hour and a half now.
Right. Any
Is your
closing thoughts? Yeah, we can wrap up the recording.
I was gonna say, oh, the recording's
It's
still going.
I think it's still going, and my red light is still blinking.
Your red
Do you
light is
have
still
yeah?
blinking. I
Do you have anything
haven't
you want people to
taken
check
out.
out, or anything you want to promote, or anything?
Um, I am new to this kind of saying anything to do with promoting. I'm on Twitter. Visa and I are friends on Twitter.
Right. Yes.
Mayli. Look out for my writing, which will come. If you're interested in my newsletter, um, ah, right now it's a tiny letter at Mayli, Mayli. I'll probably move to Substack, so very tiny letter. Um, but yeah, let me know. Hit me up. DMs are open.
My earphones just died. It's like perfect timing. Let me end the
Oh,
recording.
nice.
Where is my? I'm gonna crop out this last
Oh,
10. But
okay. I was gonna say your local bookstores.
yes, excellent. How do I end the recording? Oh, you can pause the recording. I didn't know that.